Welcome, church, to my home. So glad that you're with us this afternoon. This is our Thursday Bible study. We're in the book of John, and we're at chapter 5 and 6 today. That's what we're studying. And then next week we'll do 7 and 8. I just think 7 and 8. I think that's plenty. So I just want to welcome you to my home again. I'm just washed my hair, so I'm kind of raw, and sitting by my window where I can look out and see the horses, and just ready for our Bible study. We're in John chapter 5, which tells the story of Jesus performing a miracle, and then of course, the Jews. And remember, in John, whenever he refers to the Jews, he's referring to the Jewish leadership that challenged Jesus because he performed the miracle on the Sabbath. As we know, in Jewish interpretation of the Sabbath, there was to be no work, and no work included just about everything. It was to be a complete and total day of rest. So it starts off right off the bat in John 5 talking about that the feast was coming. And so we're not really sure, according to scholars, which feast this is. There are three big feasts in Jewish tradition. The first, of course, is the Passover, which most of us are aware of. And there are 4 Passovers mentioned in the 3.5 years of Jesus' ministry. And this one doesn't say it's specifically the Passover, though. There's also and of course, just so we remember and are on the same page, the Passover coming out of Exodus, of course, commemorates the Exodus from Egypt and the slavery that preceded it. And remember that the death was to come, and they were to paint the blood over their doorways, and death would pass by, the Passover. The other one that it could be is Pentecost. And that's a Jewish feast in Exodus 23 and also in 34 that commemorates Moses receiving the divine law on Sinai. And it's also referred to as the Festival of Weeks. It's usually in May or June. And that's when originally, prior to them kind of turning the focus to commemorating Moses receiving a divine law, to the offering of the first fruits of the Lord. And then there is a third feast, which I find probably personally one of my favorite feasts. It's called Purim, Purim, and that commemorates the defeat of Haman and his plot to massacre the Jewish people 2,500 years ago. And you can read about that in Esther. It's that whole story of Esther, where the other 2 feasts are usually pretty solemn occasions. This feast, Purim, is a very loud, colorful celebration over the story of Esther and how she went to the king and saved the Jewish people. And so those are the potential feasts that we're talking about taking place in this opening section of John 5. Now, we also know in verses 1 through 4, we're at Bethsaida. And Bethsaida is north of the temple in Jerusalem, and it's a pool, and it did have 5 porches. Actually, archaeologists have found it. And so in this section, we see the people, multitudes of people around the water. And of course, the whole notion is that the waters will be troubled and the first person in gets healed. So the eyes of all of these people are fixed on the water. Even though Jesus himself, who has already been known as a miracle worker, Jesus himself is right in their midst, but they're so hyper-focused on the water that they don't even realize that Jesus is right there. So Jesus then asks a very sincere question of a man who has been sitting by the water for 38 years. And he asks a sincere question whether he wants to be healed. Why would Jesus do that? Why would he make a question of, do you want to be healed? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, let's kind of be honest here. Not every sick person wants to be healed. And in this case, it meant that the one thing that he had done for 38 years, which was beg for alms, would be done as soon as he was healed. So he had missed the opportunity as a Jewish man to be trained as an apprentice, as a young person, as he came into his adulthood. And so, what kind of trade does he have? The other thing is to remember is that some sick people lose all hope due to discouragement, and if he had lost all hope, he might not have really cared. And so we see here Jesus wanting to make sure that he really wants to be healed. And now it's fascinating to me in verses 7 through 9 that this crippled man assumes that Jesus knows how things work at this pool. And while he's hopeful, that's why he's there, he's also hopeless because every time the water starts to stir, others get there first. And so that's why he asks, or do you have a mat and you're going to move me in? So here the sick man is actually limiting God's help to his own specific ideas. He's very narrow-minded. So not only is he focused on the water, he's also focused on there's only one way to do this, and that's to be lowered into the water, the very first one lowered into the water when the water begins to be troubled. So when Jesus asks him to take up his mat and walk, he's challenging the man to believe Jesus for the impossible. But interestingly enough, and this is where the man still had great hope, he responds in faith and did exactly what Jesus said. And he picked up his mat and he walked. He trusted that Jesus knew what he was doing, which is a real step of faith. And of course, Jesus does this on the Sabbath, and that's what's going to get Jesus into trouble. And we see that in verses 10 through 13 that that he's carrying his mat. And that was a violation of the rabbi's interpretation of the command to do no work or business on the Sabbath, which was the human interpretation of God's law. Jesus persistently maintained that it's lawful on the Sabbath to do good. Now, note that the question of the Jews to the man is not, why did you do this? The question is, who said to you, take up your mat and walk? The interest is in who told him to carry the mat on the Sabbath. It's not focused on who healed you. They weren't concerned about healing. Remember, throughout the gospel, we find that the Jewish leaders are accused and criticized for just wanting to heap burdens on the backs of man. They just want things done their way. And so here we have the Jews focusing on Jesus breaking the Sabbath, where the crippled man was focused on Jesus having made him well. So that's very fascinating in this section of Scripture as well. And then we also find that at the very end of it, as the man is picking up his mat and walking, Jesus withdraws. Jesus has no intention of healing all of the multitudes that are there. So in verses 14 and 15, we see Jesus approaching this man later on, because Jesus is concerned not only with the man's physical health, he's also very concerned about the man's spiritual health. And we'll read that in just a few moments. And then in verses 16 through 18, you can see that whether there's a healing or not, whether this guy is whole or not, the Jews were really just concerned that their religious rule had been broken. From their perspective, when it said that God rested on the seventh day, their interpretation of that is, okay, well, we can't do anything. There's no work. We're just going to lay around. We're not going to do anything at all. And what Jesus is saying is, yes, God the Father rested from creating, but he didn't rest from, shall we say, persevering or governing. And then we see Jesus claiming God as his Father. In verses 19 and 20, we see his relationship and work with God the Father. And he says that he does nothing independent of the Father, but that he's a perfect reflection of the will and the work of the Father. And this relationship is one of father and son, and it's bound in love. It's not master and slave. It's not employer or employee. And this really starts ticking off the Jews. Now we see that in verses 21 through 23 of chapter 5, there are three functions which belong to Jesus as Son of God. One is giver of life. The second one is he's the bringer of judgment. And the third one is that he's the receiver of honor. And then in verses 25 through 29, we have the messianic claims of Jesus standing out very clearly for the very first time. John is making he's not hedging. He's saying Jesus is claiming to be the Messiah. And then we see that in 31 through 39 that Jesus is referring to Deuteronomy 19:15, where 2 or 3 witnesses establish the matter. And the witnesses or the testimonies that Jesus refers to in this section is John the Baptist himself, who comes before. His own work attests to who he is. The Father gives testimony to who he is. And then he closes with, and Scripture itself attests to who I am, in both Moses and the prophets. And he's referring here, and you can look them up, Deuteronomy 18:15, Numbers 21, 8 through 9, Numbers 20, 8 through 12, and Leviticus chapters 1 through chapters, all the way through chapter 7. That's what we see in this whole section. So Jesus very much is establishing himself as the Son of God. And this is really going to upset the Jews very much. We'll see very early on in John's gospel, Jesus is irritating the Jewish leaders. So there we have chapter 5. Then we're going to go into chapter 6, and we'll do a kind of an overview of that as well. God bless you. See you on chapter 6.